Hey everyone, in this video I want to talk about Arc-enabled VMware vSphere. Do not adjust your sets, you are not in the twilight zone. So the goal here is if we think about Azure, what I want to be able to do is to bring insight into my VMware resources that I can view and inventory through Azure, but also then bring some of the Azure capabilities to the VMware environment, including control, management, provisioning of those services. So it's all about bringing that Arc-enabled VMware vSphere level of management for those servers. But here's the key thing. I'm not managing the vSphere environment through Azure. It's about managing the virtual machines running on vSphere. I'm not creating data stores and networks and clusters from Azure. It's really about controlling the resources that run on that vSphere environment. Now, if we actually look at, well, what is part of a VMware environment? Well, very similar to any other construct, we have n number of hosts. Now, all of those hosts are running the ESXi, that is the hypervisor. So all of these are running the same hypervisor. What we would do is we would group those into clusters. We would also think about, well, there's going to be data stores that we have configured. There's networks that we have configured. We may even divide up into logical constructs portions of the cluster into things like resource pools. So I could create a particular resource pool, which is a part of the compute capacity of that particular cluster. And then we also have very useful things like templates, which we use to then go and create the various resources. Now, what we have from the management plane for that VMware environment is vCenter. So a crucial part of this whole story is vCenter. And it's vCenter, if we think about it, that really communicates and manages all of the resources, all of the nodes, understands the templates. That is the control plane, the management fabric of that VMware environment. So I think VMware vSphere, vCenter is that interface through which I do all of the management. And what I want to do is I want to connect this VMware vSphere environment to Azure. And so what we need is a connectivity of those control planes. Now, the way we do this is we deploy something called a resource bridge. So this is an appliance. So this is an appliance that is provided by Microsoft, and this is going to then go and talk to the vCenter for us. And it is the resource bridge that establishes the connection to Azure. Now that connection could be over the public network. It could be using a proxy. At time of recording, it does not support private link. So it's either going to have the public network or I configure it to use a proxy. And so the key point here is none of these components are talking to Azure. It's only this resource bridge, this appliance that we deploy into the VMware environment that establishes that outbound connection to the regular 443. Is always that port. And all the communication is via there. It talks to vCenter. vCenter talks to all of the other resources. So that's really the key part of this. Now, a single resource bridge could actually communicate to multiple vCenters. I don't have to have one resource bridge per vCenter. I think it's 10,000 virtual machines is supported per resource bridge. So providing I had maybe multiple vCenters, that the sum of them was below 10,000 VMs and the latency to the vCenters was small enough, hey, I could absolutely share a resource bridge. What will happen in Azure when I go and onboard this, each particular vCenter that I add, well, that will show up as a new custom location. So in Azure, we'll see this custom location resource. So it's going to get added. And today, this is a one-to-one mapping. There'll be a custom location for each of your vCenters. But again, the resource bridge itself that does the communication could talk to multiple vCenters. Now, to onboard this, it's actually pretty simple. If we jump over for a second and go and have a look. So where I'm starting from is, let's just go home. I'm just looking at Azure Arc. And down here we have our VMware vCenters. And at time of recording, again, it's in preview. So I would select this. I've got one onboarded already, but I would just do add. And all I'm doing here is either I could create a new resource bridge or use an existing resource bridge. We have those options. But if I create a new resource bridge, it's going to ask me for a few basic things. The name for this particular connectivity, the subscription, the resource group I want to connect it in. What is the custom location name I'm going to create in Azure to represent this new vCenter and its connected clusters? The vCenter name in Azure. And what all of this will do is it's just going to generate a script. So if I went through it, it's just going to give me a script to run. And when I run that script, I would execute that in my VMware environment. And as part of that execution, it's going to ask you, okay, well, which resource pool, what storage, what network is this actually going to go and get connected to? I can orchestrate all of this through the various AZ Arc appliance CLI commands. And really, I don't know if it matters, but behind the scenes, this resource bridge is just a single node Kubernetes cluster hosting a bunch of Microsoft agentry, and it's a fully Microsoft managed resource. I just have to, when I run the script, tell it, hey, which resources on here do you deploy to? It downloads all the various components to create this little virtual appliance, and it's up and running. I think it's about 100 gigabytes of storage, 16 gigabytes of RAM, and 4 virtual CPUs is the recommended configuration for this. And again, it's only this that needs outbound 443. Nothing else here is talking to Azure at all. So it's very easy to onboard this. Now, as soon as I do onboard it, what I get straight away is if I think about, well, now the resource bridge can talk to vCenter, now it's Arc-enabled. What will now show up in Azure is the inventory. So I'm going to get inventory capability to see all of the things that are running from that vCenter. So if again we jump over and have a little look at this, I've already onboarded one. And what I can see is, well, hey, I can see the various virtual machines that are running on here. I can see the resource pools. Again, a resource pool is just a subset of the compute capability of a cluster. There's a root resource pool for the cluster, and I can create child resource pools to have a hierarchy. I can see my templates that I might have. I can see things like the different networks that I have in the environment. I can see the data stores. So all of this is now available just from a very, very basic visibility of the inventory. But you'll actually notice on a lot of these, you see this, well, what Azure enabled, yes. But a lot of them, the Azure enabled is no. So the key point here is you have complete control over which bits you actually want to Azure enable. It's not just going to do it all by default. What I actually have to do is, hey, I would go and select the particular resources, and then you would hit this enable in Azure. So you have complete control over, yes, there's all that inventory that it discovers that it's, hey, talking to the vCenter, and it knows about it all. that you get to fully pick, well, which bits do I actually want to enable in Azure? So I then get to say, hey, I want to enable for Azure these particular resources, these particular data stores, these particular networks, these particular nodes or clusters or resource pools, these particular templates. I pick exactly what bits I want to enable. Now to do this enablement from a permissions perspective, I have to have, there are special Arc permissions. So in this case, there is an Azure Arc VMware admin role. So I have to have that role to be able to enable those things for Azure. And when I run that enable Azure, now what kind of bursts to life? Whatever I enable for Azure, well, those things that I've enabled for Azure, well, they now get ARM resources. So what particular data store I've enabled, what particular virtual networks, whatever I've done, those things now get an ARM resource. But I have to have that permission. I have that complete control. Now, when I do enable those things, and let's actually look at virtual machines, because virtual machines is maybe an interesting one, because remember, that's the key point in terms of the control capability. If I go and let's actually order it by virtual hardware. So we can see for these ones, and notice they're a different color. They're blue, which means I can click on them. So these have been enabled for Azure. And notice for the VMs, there's this other level I can go to about guest management. But we're going to come back to that. So the point is, once I have enabled them for Azure, if I now go and select one of these, well, notice I can start them, I can restart them, I can stop them. If it was stopped, I could do things like, well, hey, I can add disks, I could delete disks, I could change the physical characteristics of the virtual machine, number of CPUs, amount of memory. So straight away, I get a level of management of the resource. So just by doing this idea of enable for Azure, as soon as I do that enable for Azure, what it now lights up is, well, at this point, I can manage the VM resource. And what that means is, well, you saw it. I can do start, I can do stop, I can do resize of the hardware, I can do disk management. So I get all of these capabilities just by doing the enable for Azure. So I get that ability. Now there are some permissions I need to do this, but once again, all of this enable for Azure, this management set of structure here, all of that is done through the resource bridge. When I'm performing those start, stops, to resize the disks, it's sending the signal to the resource bridge, which sends the signal to vCenter, which then goes and sends the signal wherever it needs to go to do some operation on the VM. So once again, there's no other connectivity required. It's all happening. Azure talks to the resource bridge to vCenter, vCenter to the host or the VM itself, depending on what it's trying to do. But it's following the natural control and management planes of the different resources. So still, no other connectivity required for any of this management of the virtual machine. Now, there is another level for the virtual machines we can go. If we notice, we also have these other types of operations. Machine configuration, i.e. guest OS policy, updates, inventory. There are Defender security solutions. Well, that's all being powered by Azure Arc. So if we go back to here, you'll notice this concept of the guest management. So if I have a virtual machine that's enabled for Azure but not guest management, well, then I have the ability to enable for guest management. Now it's going to need a credential that has the permission to actually deploy the Azure Arc agent, i.e. the connected machine agent will get deployed. Now I can enable multiple machines at the same time. Let's just select these 4. I could say enable in Azure. And at the same time, I could say enable the guest management. So I could do it in one step. Now, the disadvantage with this approach of multiple machines enabling for the guest management, well, it means what it's having to do here is the same credential for all of those VMs. Whereas if I use something like the CLI, I could script it in a loop. I could go and talk to a local vault with different credentials and light those up. But the key part here is, let's go to another color. I like using all the different colors up here. So once I've gone ahead and I've enabled it for Azure, then what I can do is enable for the guest OS. And what this is doing is installing and enabling it for Arc. So anything enabled for the guest OS, it's enabling for Arc. Now at that point, Arc has to go and talk to Azure. Now Arc has its own things that it can support, but now yes, the Arc will go and talk to Azure. So when I do the Arc-enabled server functions, and I have a whole separate video on Arc-enabled server, that's going through the Arc. It's still an outbound connection to 443. But now, yes, if it's the guest OS portion, anything related to that, that is not going via the resource bridge. That is now Arc enabling it. The Arc enabling of a server OS is free. And all of the same features that are free are still free. The features that I pay for, well, I still pay for. It's really just bringing and onboarding it to Arc. So in this case, hey, for any VM that I go and say, hey, I want the guest OS capabilities, there could be another VM over here. There could be lots of them. You get the idea. Anything I guest enable, hey, it's going to go and install that connected machine agent, and they will go and do those communications. So that's the way that is all going to function. But that's just like the regular set of Arc-enabled server. But it's bringing it all together so that, hey, through that Arc experience, I can just go and leverage that. But that's the different sets of functionality that it's doing. So, hey, when I do this guest OS, this is Arc-enabled. So great. I can see it, I can inventory, I can start, stop, resize, manage the disks and all of those things. But I can actually go a level further. So let's give ourselves a little bit of space. Imagine I'm just a regular user. So now we'll just be a regular user. I'm up here. And sure, if I have the right permissions, which we'll get into, yes, I can start, stop, resize stuff, whatever I want to do. But I can also now think about, well, what if they actually want to do provisioning? I want to, as the user, into Azure, maybe I want to actually go and create a virtual machine. Now, because I'm doing this via the Azure control plane, this interaction could be Portal, it could be the CLI, it could be PowerShell, it could be REST, it could be a template. That could be a JSON template, that could be a bicep template. It doesn't matter. I'm going via the just Azure control plane. So now think about this as the user. Hey, I can use the one Azure control plane to create stuff in Azure, but I could also now go and create stuff in my on-prem VMware clouds through the same interaction, the same templates, the same CLIs. Now, I've mentioned permissions a few times. So let's actually talk about those permissions. There's actually 2 permissions that the user needs to create and do all of these different management things. Now realize you have this environment down here, all of those Arc-enabled vSphere. So what I need here to be able to consume and manage the resources, well, there's this idea of an Azure Arc VMware private cloud. So I need that Azure Arc VMware private cloud permission. That's on the VMware environment, and we can see this. So let's jump over, make sure I'm getting the name exactly right, so I'm getting forgetful. So if I was to let's just pick a resource group, because then we can see all of the different roles. It's easy to see. If we look at the various roles that matter, remember I talked about the admin role, first of all. So to be able to actually manage the vSphere environments, we can see the Azure Arc VMware administrator role. So that's if I actually want to go and manage those onboarding of the vSphere. If I just want to be a user, well, this is where you have the Azure Arc VMware private cloud user role. So that's why I have to have assigned to me on the Azure Arc-enabled VMware vSphere resources. But then what I also need, in the subscription I create my new VM, I need Azure Arc VMware VM contributor. So there's 2 roles. So if we go back again to our picture, for me to interact, so is there Azure Arc VMware private cloud user. So I have to have this role on the vSphere resources. Now, either that could be at the resource group that contains it, or I could set it on the data stores, on the networks, on the resource pool, on the templates. Remember, I'm going to need all 4 accesses. Because if I want to go and create a VM, well, remember, to create a VM, it has to be stored somewhere, it has to connect to a network, it has to exist on some compute plane somewhere, and it has to use a template. So I'd need that permission on the resources. But then realize this resource I'm actually creating in Azure when I'm creating the ARM-enabled resource, well, where does that get created? Well, that's actually getting created in a particular subscription in a particular resource group. And I'll specify that when I do the create. So what that means is, in addition to needing the permission on the vSphere resources, the second permission I have to have is on the target resource group or sub. So that's where I also have to have tick the Azure Arc VMware VM contributor role. So there's 2 roles I need, because although the vSphere resources exist in a certain resource group and subscription, I could now actually go and create a VM that's consuming those resources in any subscription in the same Azure AD or Microsoft Entra ID tenant. It doesn't have to be the same one. So I could go and create a VM in a completely different subscription that then goes and consumes these resources. So if you think logically, it makes sense. Hey, I want to create a VM on this. So I need a permission to consume these resources. So either I get this permission at a resource group or sub that owns all this, or I'm given the permission at each of the individual 4 resources I need. And then I'm also creating an Azure resource. So I need this permission to create the Azure Arc VMware VM resource. So I need the contributor role at the sub or the resource group where I'm actually going to go and create it. So that's really the whole idea behind it. And we can see this. So if I was to go and look at a particular resource, so let's actually jump back to my Azure Arc, and we'll look at our VMware. So obviously at this level, the vCenter, These will contain the roles around the Arc VMware administration and the onboarding. And then if I actually look at the resources within it that have been Azure enabled, remember, if I look at, let's say, this, if I wasn't given it at that resource group level, well, now at this particular cluster, hey, I would go and give the users the Azure Arc VMware private cloud user role. And then I would go and give them that exact same role at the enabled template, at the enabled network, at the enabled data store. And then the user would then need that other permission we talked about, the Azure Arc VMware VM contributor, where they actually go and create the VM. And let's look at that experience. So now I could go and look at my virtual machines. I want to create a new virtual machine, but it's more VMs and related solutions. And I'm going to pick my Azure Arc virtual machine. And the key point here is it's the custom location. So this custom location tells it it's VMware. And then what I would see is all of the resource pools, all of the templates that have been Azure enabled, and I have that private cloud user permission on. And I would just go through and it would go and create it for me. So that's really all of the key point between all of that. But again, what's really nice here is that for the user, I get one experience. Hey, yeah, I can go and create stuff through Azure, but hey, I can also go and now create things. It's going to consume these resources. But if I also then onboard it for the guest, not only could I do the basic control stuff through the Azure control plane and the CLI commands and everything else, but I could also then get into the machine, the guest OS configuration. I could then light up the other Azure capabilities to that. And so that's the point. I mean, the whole goal around this is to bring that VMware vSphere inventory, and then if I want to, for the different resources, control, and then if I want to, and give it to particular people, the ability to actually provision onto it as well through a very seamless experience. And then I can bring as many Azure capabilities as I want when I go and enable it for the guest operating systems. So just a really great seamless experience. Now, I do not know the pricing yet. It is in preview at time of recording, so obviously at the moment it's free. I don't know if there will be a charge or not. I certainly know that the guest OS, what's free for Arc-enabled server will be free. The stuff that you pay for Arc-enabled server, you will pay for. So just the question is, hey, what happens to the rest of it? I don't know what they will do there, but at GA, maybe I'll go and update a link in the description. There'll be a link for the pricing. But I mean, that's the goal of this. Once again, the only communication for the basic management, the inventory, the enabling is just via the resource bridge. The only time any other connectivity is required if I turn on the guest OS, and then it's Arc enabling via the connected machine agent, and then they just do that outbound to Azure, and now all your VMware stuff is lit up as well. I hope that was useful. Till next video, take care.